All right, everyone, welcome to the Silly Sage broadcast. I'm your host, David Joseph King, coming at you today with a topic on wisdom versus the prophets. Hope everybody's doing good, having fun. I'm definitely having fun today. I love some of the stuff. I love some of the topics, and we're going to have a little bit of fun checking out different perspectives, probably than you've heard before. Maybe not. But this is likely going to be like 2 or more part series, as I'm going to attempt to break down the content into smaller, more digestible bites for the time being before doing longer podcasts and kind of get a gauge for which is a better route to take. All right, so in this episode, we're going to look at aspects of when the writers of the wisdom texts and the prophetic texts clash, which is actually really noticeable if you know what you're looking for and the context behind the evolution of some of the writings. Okay. This particular episode is going to give a backdrop on the thought process leading up to the introduction of the wisdom texts, which come a little bit later. And it's going to reveal some of the conflicts among some of the writers. And you can spot some of this stuff. If anybody's actually familiar with my work on like Bible history, specifically in the work of the original Jesus movement versus early Christianity, you can see that there is definitely many places in the Bible where the authors are getting into disputes with one another and addressing each other through their writings. They're not often very general. When you hear something like, if you hear somebody say this or that, then bad. They're not just talking in general aspects. They're actually talking about one another or specific groups that are saying something different than what they're saying. So you can also spot this inside of the Old Testament. And we're going to do this now, where in the title of this is called Wisdom versus the Prophets. You know, a nice little clickbait title because it's not something that's really talked about a whole lot. But first, I'm going to paint a backdrop. And it's going to be really cool because it's going to be informative to get an idea on different topics. It's going to give an idea of different backstory when it comes to the aspect of good and evil. So when writers are actually throwing shade at one another, some can look at this as somewhat passive aggressive, but they also didn't have phones or a way of communicating easily to meet up. So we might want to just give them some room on this. But anyhow, so in order to get into this topic in more depth, we're going to dive into the topic of good and evil. Specifically, the evolution of answers to many questions people have in the journey of life, and how different groups in the Bible attempted to come up with answers, and how these answers are in conflict with each other and their respective groups. So that's going to be fun. In short, not only did some of these guys in the Bible disagree with each other, but they also threw mad shade at each other and ended up actually talking a lot of shit, just to be quite frank, but which I think is hysterical, but I can pretty much laugh at anything. So, anyhow, it's all good. Okay. So of all the various philosophical and theological arguments against the existence of God, the topic of evil is the hardest one to smooth over. You get questions in life like, why is life full of suffering? And why do bad things happen to good people? You do everything right, and yet somehow it seems like life is punishing you. Or other questions like, why do the righteous suffer? And why do the wicked prosper? Some of those questions and things are definitely found out, and there's definitely a good question. People who have been in this world long enough can actually see some injustices of some sort, So why do shitty people seem to be very successful, maybe even live a long, healthy, and wealthy life? If there is a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, who is perfectly good, as many ascribe to God in their beliefs, then why would such a God allow such things to happen? Or why is the universe even set up that way? Now, some of these answers are a little bit more simpler from those whose beliefs are directly connected to the Bible, which will be a general necessity of evil enabling a free will. But this answer, seemingly biblical, often referenced with the garden story as Adam having a choice is actually in direct conflict with many writers of the Bible. So some of you, maybe even in Christian circles, may have heard things like, if you experience severity in things like warfare or resistance, this is proof that you're doing a great work for God. And well, while in the same framework of thought, if you point out a person who's homeless and oppressed and on drugs or alcohol, the answer changes into a potential futures of doing a great work for God. Like, the harder your life is, the bigger you're calling for God. And the enemy knows this, which we can really apply to anyone, really, who is not actually doing a great work for God at all. So these are some of the answers one could come across to try to make sense of things. And we have this perspective inside of the Bible. We have very many different perspectives trying to make sense of things. Now, in order to paint this backdrop effectively of the issue with wisdom versus the prophets, we have to go way back before the development of monotheism into what we would call paganism, or polytheism, many different gods, worship of many gods. Now, prior to the sort of modern world religions that exist now, mostly in the terms of Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but even other world religions that also address this. The religions of the old gods that existed before didn't really have this problem with trying to come up with explanations like this because they were kind of, really built in. Like, if there are multiple gods for every kind of force that you encounter in life, let's say God of death or the God of the sun or the God of lightning, God of water, God of crops, God of animals, etc. If every single one of those things that people experience is linked to a different God, then it's possible that even though you may be actually doing good things towards your God, you might actually be pissing off another God and getting hit with some of these forces. So you may very well be beloved of Neptune, but it could be that Juno don't like you and has a kibosh out for you. So paganism is always, and just as a side note, I hate that word because it was really heavily propagated by the Catholic Church to explain people who don't think of things in terms of Roman Catholicism. So it kind of mashed everything in there. But I'll just use it in terms of the polytheistic kind of perspective. So paganism is always able to make these kinds of explanations of why you've been cursed and why the fates and the furies seem to follow your ass around everywhere because there's multiple competing forces of chaos. And that perspective is actually baked into many of the old religions. So they don't really have too much of a problem with coming up with answers like that. But what happens once you move past all that and you have people that begin to establish orderly state societies with law literature, more consideration of the universe being more orderly and not so chaotic? So the priests and the philosophers began to observe the orderly movements of the heavenly bodies, and they can stop and say, wait a minute, this isn't all just chaos like the sun, the moon, the stars. They're all doing things in a very regular and predictable way. So those thinkers began to speculate that the universe at its root may not be as chaotic as their ancestors thought it was. In fact, even the universe has a prime mover or a central source, which is a force of order and often speculated as a force of good. So if that's the case, that changes the equation in terms of why the problem of evil and why do the righteous suffer. Like, WTF, bro? What the heck? If anybody's ever asked themselves that, probably not in the same manner, but pretty close. So as that framework of thought is developing early on, people, started to come up with different ideas and presented them to the people. So in the biblical era, when the Old Testament is being written and the Israelites and the ancient Jews create a central thesis of the section of books that come right after the Torah attributed to Moses, which is generally called by scholars the Deuteronomic histories. Okay. Now, these are the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. All right. So those are those kind of form the supposed historical cycle of ancient Israel. Now, what the solution is in terms of the thinkers who composed that text always show in these cycles that Israel or Judah prosper when the people turn away from paganism and idolatry and instead worship the God of Israel, the one God, Yahweh, in the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, when you're in support of the state religion of monotheism, Israel and Judah are successful. But when they turn away and kind of forget Yahweh and turn to other gods, they're punished in these stories. So that's their explanation. You serve Yahweh, you get blessed. You serve idols and pagan worship and other deities, you're punished. So the problem of evil during this timeline, according to the Deuteronomic writers, priests, and prophets who wrote these texts of the Bible, the problem is not an individual one, it is a corporate one. So they're not really thinking in terms of how an individual gets blessed or why does an individual suffer. They're actually saying, why do the people as a whole suffer? So why does our tribe and why does our kingdom suffer? The belief here is that Yahweh blesses the people and their king when the people turn away from idol worship, and they only worship Yahweh at his cult center in Jerusalem, in the temple, which is the only place worship is allowed. Now, this belief, if, let's say, the Philistines or the Midianites or the Moabites or Egyptians or whoever, they come in and attack and they oppress the people, it's because they and their king, or if in an earlier period when there was judges, them and their judges turned away from the worship of Yahweh and in turn would start going into idolatry and worshiping all the different pagan gods of their Canaanite neighbors. That's why the oppression would happen. So these legends that are remembered by these writers is very clear that it's because of idolatry that God raises up a judge or a nation to punish them, to bring them back. Then the people at some point remember Yahweh, and then they go back to Yahweh, and that's when, Egyptians or Philistines, their rulership over them is ended. Now, there is a serious problem with this answer when it comes to actual history. The Deuteronomic history is written towards the end of the first temple period, towards the reigns of Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, and the final kings right before the destruction of Jerusalem. So, when the Deuteronomists get to their own timeline and they're writing about what happens, they encounter a pretty big problem. The last three major kings has a wicked pagan king who is Manasseh, who is absolutely hated by the Deuteronomists, who is writing the book of 2 Kings. Well, he actually ends up having the longest and the most peaceful reign when, according to this belief, he should be punished, according to how the Deuteronomic cycle works. Okay? So when it comes to actually fleshing it out, the wicked pagan king who reestablished all the idols in the temple and their wonderfully sinful descriptions in the Bible, and he does this in Jerusalem, has actually a very peaceful and prosperous and long reign, whereby his father, in contrast, who had been a righteous king, Hezekiah, he faced a horrible attack by Assyria. The whole kingdom was devastated, and he barely held on, and the Assyrians weren't fully able to conquer Jerusalem, but is like by a thread. So if this framework of thought as posited in the Bible by the Deuteronomists is true, then why is he being punished by the Assyrians, given the fact that he was such a righteous king who was doing all the good things, like eliminating all the pagan idols and the cults? And yet he suffers for his trouble. Also, likewise, his righteous grandson Josiah, who also got rid of all the idols that Manasseh had put in there, and he took down the pillars, the groves, he smashed to pieces the staff of Moses and whatnot, and brings everybody into monotheism under the worship of Yahweh. He's killed off by a pharaoh at like age 39. Okay? So why would the Egyptians just be able to kill this dude off, who is a loved and celebrated righteous king who's so honored in the text as being likened unto David, but doesn't get to have a career like David because he dies young? That's not very nice. If he's trying to do all this work and then he just gets, clobbered, and the other guy who does a bunch of work for the bad team, we would say, gets to prosper. So this was already a problem in real life when the Deuteronomists were writing their histories. All right. So it becomes even more like problematic and pronounced at the end of the first temple period. After the Babylonian captivity, after the exile from Babylonian captivity, the Jewish nobles, they come back and they re-find Jerusalem, and the second temple period begins. After they get rid of all their idolatry, absolutely all of their suffering still remains. All right. So the Deuteronomic answer to people suffering of idolatry may have been kind of received easier, possibly, considering that during the first temple period, Judah was largely paganistic. So they weren't just worshiping Yahweh only. They did worship Yahweh, but they didn't worship him only. They worshiped multiple gods. So telling them that one God is upset at them for worshiping other gods could make sense to them. But put into practice, it actually did nothing for them, because when we get to the period of the Second Temple, which is 516 BC all the way up to 70 AD, paganism was largely extinguished. So the Jewish people during that whole time period really did only worship Yahweh. So one would think, okay, now that we got it right, we've eliminated the pagan stuff, the idolatry, all the groves, the pillars, the altars, and all the temples, and all that kind of stuff. One would think we should have a long streak of blessing and prosperity for the Jewish people, considering they are no longer worshiping anybody else except Yahweh. Well, no. They have to deal with the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Greeks, the Romans, Herod, etc. There is not a time where there's no suffering for the Jewish people. Okay? Despite the fact that they've pretty much done exactly what they were supposed to do, and they did exactly what Yahweh wanted. So, now, other biblical authors have to come up with a reason of why this is going on and why it's an ongoing suffering, and we need another answer to the problem of evil, because it's clearly not just because we're worshiping idols or Yahweh properly or not properly, because that shit obviously did not work out. Okay? So now we have to have another answer to solve this problem. And that's what we're going to get into next. Okay, so now we have the backdrop set up in this episode. Next up, we're going to deal with some of the new books of wisdom that now gets added into the bunch. That gets added in the Second Temple period and offers a new perspective of answers to this problem. And we're going to actually compare those answers to the Deuteronomist perspective and the clash of the ideologies that occur in the text itself because of it. All right, so now that the perspectives of the Deuteronomists have turned out to be a total flop, other biblical authors now have to come up with a reason why their people are still suffering. And we need another answer to the problem of evil because, well, it's clearly not because of idolatry and not worshiping Yahweh properly. Okay, that's bullshit. And maybe they okay, in order to keep the people going, we got to come up with better answers than this, okay? Well, in the Second Temple period, we get introduced to two more types of books, okay? And these are the books of wisdom that get added to the Bible. Both of these, which are two types of wisdom books, okay, where people are speculating about this or that, and they're trying to come up with answers or solutions to both this issue and, well, other issues as well. These are divided into two different types of wisdom books, which are the prudential wisdom and the reflective wisdom. Okay. Anybody ever heard of these? All right. Among the earliest type of wisdom books is actually the book of Proverbs, which is actually a multiple collection of wisdom sayings. All right, so then there's the book of Job, and then later books like Ecclesiastes, and then also within the Apocrypha or Deuterochronicals, not the Protestant Bible, but the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Bibles, you get the book of Sirach. okay, as well as Ecclesiasticus and the book of the Wisdom of Solomon, which are just both prudential, just like Proverbs. So jumping right into it, what is prudential wisdom? Well, prudential wisdom is really like the book of Proverbs. It's a really key example of this, which contains all these kind of like short, pithy, concise sayings like, Ben Franklin's "A penny saved is a penny earned." To acquire knowledge, one must study, but to acquire wisdom, one must observe, by Marilyn Savant. Okay. Kindness is the language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see, by Mark Twain. All right. Live as though you're going to die tomorrow, but learn as if you're going to live forever, Mahatma Gandhi. Okay. He's without sin, cast the first stone. All right, attributed to Jesus Christ. So in Proverbs, you have these kind of like one-liner banger kind of saying proverbs, like the idle hands make for poverty, but busy hands makes for riches. Okay, stuff like that in Proverbs. All right, hate is always looking for a quarrel, but love overcomes every offense, or overlooks every offense, right? He who loves correction loves knowledge, but he who hates rebuke is stupid. Okay, that's funny. He who hates rebuke is stupid. That's funny. Okay, so another one in Proverbs. To be patient shows great understanding, and a quick temper is the height of folly. All right. To the downtrodden, every day is wretched, but to have a merry heart is a perpetual feast. All right. And even a fool, if he shuts his mouth, will at least appear wise. Okay. Some of these are actually pretty funny. And in a lot of cases, a lot of these are actually really good advice. The problem is actually when you dig down a little too deep into these, you'll actually take them as being always true, always right, all the time. Like if you have idle hands and you're not doing anything, you won't become rich, right? But just because you're working hard doesn't mean you're going to get paid right. And it also doesn't mean you're going to be rich, despite it being written in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 4. Okay. So just because that's there doesn't mean it's going to be true all the time. Okay. So in general, the idea of prudential wisdom is kind of like common sense sayings, and they're pretty much like an ancient form of like the original memes, much like you see on social media. All right. So it's like, look up, look ahead, keep up, keep your head up, don't argue with a fool, work hard, have a good attitude, keep your mouth shut, do good things. These are kind of like common sense kind of stuff that kind of like people are attracted to because they just seem very straightforward and kind of easy to grasp. Okay. Well, actually these wisdom sayings are part of a wider Eastern tradition. So you have Proverbs chapter 30, right? Which is a subtitled, it's a collection of Agar, son of Jacob of Massa. So in other words, this is a collection of wisdom from a person who's non-Jewish, non-Israelite, who's from Arabia. Okay, it's from an Arabic man. Also, you'll find in Proverbs from either the middle or the beginning of chapter 22 all the way to chapter 24, it's actually sampled from an earlier Egyptian text called the Instruction of Amenemope. And it's actually written centuries earlier, which now gets changed into Hebrew, translated, and brought in as if it's an original Hebrew source that are supposedly from Solomon, but that's just actually not the case whatsoever. Okay. So the wisdom traditions, unlike what we see in the prophetic works, aren't actually focused on Yahweh at all, really. They're actually focused on wisdom, which in the Hebrew is chokmah. And the focus in these texts is to get you to be wise, as opposed to your focus being on your religious devotion only and doing it correctly. All right. So the authors of the wisdom tradition were actually often at odds with the prophets, and the prophets didn't really like the people who were speaking wisdom or writing wisdom books. For example, the prophet Jeremiah wrote concerning wisdom books, "How can you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us, when in fact the pen of the scribes have made it into a lie? The wise shall be put to shame, and they shall be dismayed and taken, since they've rejected the word of the Lord. What wisdom is in them?" Okay, so Jeremiah's throwing down here, and he's saying you really shouldn't be listening to these wise guys with wise sayings who's talking about what's wise and what's not wise. What's really wise is listening to prophets like me, Jeremiah. And it's not just with Jeremiah. Isaiah gets in the ring with these people too. And who's another important prophet in the Old Testament, he steps up to wisdom writers and he writes concerning them, "The Lord said, because these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And their worship of me is a commandment learned by rote. So I will again do amazing things with these people, shocking and amazing. The wisdom of the wise shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning shall be hidden." Okay, so Isaiah is not a fan here of the wise or of wisdom. Unsurprisingly, though, the wisdom writers do have an answer to the problem of evil that is separate from what the Deuteronomists have. For the wisdom writers, the solution to the problem of evil is in fact wisdom herself. Wisdom is often personified as kind of a female angel who has an aspect or an attribute of God. And this is where we begin to get the kind of traditions of wisdom being that of more like feminine, kind of a motherly type figures. And in the Greek, wisdom is translated Sophia. So there's a lot of Sophia type writings that begin to appear more and more as the wisdom traditions begin to take root and expand all over the place. And in Judaism, at least their exposure to it. So in Proverbs, wisdom declares the Lord creating his first work and his first acts long ago. "Blessed are those who keep my ways, hear instruction, and be wise, and do not neglect it. Those who miss me injure themselves. All those who hate me love death." So if you reject wisdom and wise teachings and being thoughtful about all these wise things, then you're asking for death. So in Proverbs, supposedly written by Solomon, which is not true at all, but the character that is portrayed here promises that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom. Chapter 3 says, "My child, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For long life and abundant peace shall I give you." So the writers of wisdom are saying if you are listening to wisdom, you're going to get a very long life and peace. Looking at the question of how do you be righteous in order to avoid suffering? Well, it's by following wise precepts. Because so blessed are those who find wisdom. Long life is in her right hand and riches and honor is in her left hand, right? Okay, so it's pretty clear. What they're suggesting here is that people prosper because they are following the precepts of wisdom. So why do you suffer? Because you're stupid. Or you've been stupid. Okay, that's basically the kind of answer that you find in these wisdom literatures. The earliest one being, well, right here in Proverbs, as I was reading. But just in the same way that there are limitations of the solutions that are offered, like, by the Deuteronomists, with idolatry obviously not being the answer for why suffering exists in Israel, there's also a problem with wisdom and its solution for things. If embracing wisdom and following her instructions yields health, wealth, and a long life, then logical conclusion is that a person who is in poverty and poor health or dies young is or was foolish. As just we read wisdom say, all who hate me love death. The problem is, of course, there's lots of people who are wise and smart who die accidentally or through getting a disease or something of, a bunch of different things that can happen that have no fault of their own at all. So as a result, there is then a tradition that arises even after this that even disagrees with this kind of common sense prudential wisdom. And that's called reflective wisdom. Now, I didn't make the title Deuteronomists versus prophets versus wisdom because, well, that's too damn long of a title. But it's actually a more accurate way to describe what it is that I'm sharing. Anyhow, the reflective wisdom is in disagreement with prudential wisdom. All right. You'll find reflective wisdom in the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. And as I mentioned before, there are also prudential wisdoms in the later apocryphal books of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon. So to kind of show you the difference, I'll bring up a little bit of apocryphal stuff in Sirach, which is really kind of in alignment with Proverbs in this. The writer of Sirach says that wisdom was the first of all the created things. She built an everlasting home among mortals, and with their descendants, she will keep faith. Okay, so that's basically saying, hey, look, if you follow wisdom, and on this path of being wise, and you do all the right things, wisdom is going to keep faith with you, and you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. Whereas in the reflective wisdom writings, such as Ecclesiastes, the writer thinks about this stuff and is like, yeah, I've seen it all. From the righteous perishing in their righteousness to the wicked growing old in their wickedness. Okay, wait a minute. I thought you don't get long life unless you follow wisdom. Right? Good question. So the author of Ecclesiastes said, you know what? I've seen some wicked people become really wealthy and very healthy and live a long life. And I've known some people who are very righteous who died very young. Okay, so that's a funny thing to contemplate, because that kind of really opposes the previous answers to the solutions of evil and life and justice and righteousness and all that kind of stuff that I mentioned. In the same way, we hear in Job that it's all one. Like the author of Job says, therefore I, says God, destroy both the blameless and the wicked when disaster brings sudden death. He mocks the calamity of the innocent. Whoa. Now that's a strong critique of God here in the book of Job, which I think is pretty damn funny. It sounds a lot like wisdom in Proverbs chapter 1, where she's like, I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock you when terror strikes you. The idea being, hey, I try to reach out to you. You didn't listen. So now I'm going to laugh at you if things happen to you. I'm going to actually mock you. So I don't know why I think this stuff is so funny. I think all these just different perspectives, and when you allow yourself the freedom to actually consider all these different perspectives, it actually frees you up to have a sense of humor about it all, and gives you the freedom to actually really use your own damn mind and think about what you want, rather than having to prove this against that and use this to prove that. And it becomes like a pinball machine for your mind of like, oh, this book and this reference and this stuff to try to make it work, thinking that it's all one and unified. And it's actually not. These guys are having problems with each other, as well as trying to come up with answers to solutions of life's problems. So the problem of evil, or identifying the problem of evil when disaster strikes or like a pandemic is taking out all kinds of people, is that both wicked and innocent get hit with stuff, So the book of Job is part of this reflective wisdom tradition. That's why when disaster strikes a person in life previously, they thought, well, you must be a sinner or something, or God's pissed at you. Remember, if you're doing righteous and upright before the Lord, well, then you're supposed to be taken care of. But it seems like in Job is being handed over by God to Satan. And it's kind of funny because that's not supposed to happen either in wisdom or in the Deuteronomist kind of cycle of things. So that one's even left field. So that one's more of the reflective wisdom. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But basically, in the old way of looking at things, God's pissed at you. Or other places, when one person, the whole camp messes up, the whole camp is punished. Like David, when he messes up, Yahweh goes, sends a plague and kills 70,000 of his own people. Okay? So these are kind of different thought processes that were by these groups at different times. And the people were influenced by these writings and their attempts to explain stuff whose perspectives weighed against each other are fundamentally full of holes. So, the thoughts even carry on into the New Testament writings, whereby Jesus is reported to have been asked about a person with infirmity, whether or not that person's state of being was because of their sin or the sin of their parents. And Jesus was like, nah, this happens so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, I'm not always very happy with that translation, but whether one agrees or disagrees with that statement, the point that I've laid out is that the thought processes of the Deuteronomists, the prophets, the wisdom writers, and even the contrary wisdom writers, they evolved over time, and they do not play well with each other at all. So the narrative that this is all authored by one spirit channeling through all these different writers is just not true. Conflating the narrative and forcing it into one stream of agreement takes a serious amount of cognitive dissonance. And so I just wanted to present those views found in the Bible and leave it up to you to decide what to think, just like the people of antiquity had to decide what to think, until it was actually written and religious leaders used those to oppress other people by force or threat of some sort of kind, whether physical or mental or spiritual or afterlife narratives. And I'm not a fan of that stuff whatsoever. Anyhow, I just wanted to share that because I wanted you to know where I'm coming from in sharing some of this stuff. It's not my desire to break down faith of people or be adamantly opposed to the Bible. I love the Bible. There's all kinds of good stuff you can get in there. I'm just saying I don't like the thought controls that don't address what is right in front of us because we're now somehow being made afraid for some reason. And asking questions leads to some sort of like peril in life or something like that. As we've seen, doing all the right things can lead to peril as well. So anyhow. There's another answer that I didn't get to just yet that gets presented in the book of Job, which is a, fantastically mashed up book comprised of several books and several poems that are kind of all jumbled together and mixed up and shaken up, which are written by different authors at different times in different contexts, actually. But anyhow, I'll save that for next time because I actually want to pull that text apart and see what kind of treasures we find inside. I think that would be kind of cool. Anyhow, I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed the broadcast. Take care.